So our next discussion will focus on the power of alliances and how multi-stakeholder collaborations can drive systemic climate action across the region. We will explore how global alliances like GEAPP, GAME, and GAVI are fostering inclusive and equitable energy transitions through strategic partnerships. This session will also showcase pathways for collective action that unlock unprecedented opportunities for tackling climate challenges at scale. We are very honored to have Ravi Venkatesan, chairman of the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, a trustee of the Rockefeller Foundation. Ravi will be presenting his thoughts on driving systems change through alliances. With a distinguished career leading organizations like Microsoft India, Bank of Baroda, and Infosys, Ravi is also a pioneer in social impact, having established key initiatives like Project Shiksha and Cummins College of Engineering for Women. Let's give him a warm welcome. Thank you for being with us here today. Next up, we also have, yes, you may take a seat. Thank you so much, Ravi. Next up, we will also have Gaurav Gupta, Global Managing Partner at Dalberg Advisors. He is the former Regional Director for Asia Pacific and headed Dalberg's Global Impact Measurement and Climate and Energy Practices. Let's give him a warm welcome as well. So together they will shed light on how collaborative leadership can catalyze systems change and advance global climate goals. Let's dive into our next session.
Thank you for that introduction. And actually, I'm going to give a little mini intro to what you're about to experience. This is not, or I hope it's not, going to be some sort of exercise around how alliances are great. Actually, Ravi is going to share from very lived experience for the first 10 minutes all the nitty-gritty challenges, disappointments, but also good moments of getting these kind of things to work. I've worked with him now for, I think, almost close to 10 years. In some of these alliances, I have seen the shiny product on the outside and the challenges on the inside. He has also said that he is open to answering difficult questions from myself and from you. So as you hear him talk for the next 10 minutes, think about some spicy questions. At the end of our conversation, I'll have a chance to have a conversation with him afterwards. But at the end, I will ask for a few questions from the audience. So please give him a round of applause to bring him up.
Thank you. Are you projecting some slides? So if you don't mind. Well, good morning. Oh, I do have a clicker. Super. And as I walked in, I noticed that I have stiff competition from all your screens, various screens. So maybe I'll start with a request for you to suspend that just for a few minutes. I was at the same forum a year ago in Delhi, and I gave a talk on how to make alliances work. And I think it was reasonably well received because lo and behold, Deepali invited me again, and this time to go a little bit deeper and provide a more nuanced and perhaps a more provocative view of these issues. So what I'm going to do is talk for about 10 minutes, use that to seed a few ideas, and then we'll get into conversation. So look, when we talk about systems change, the quote or the insight which has perhaps had the greatest influence on me and my thinking is this one from J. Edwards Deming. For those of you who don't know Deming, he was the father of the quality movement in both Japan and the United States in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And he says, look, every system is perfectly designed to produce the results it does. And so the corollary is very simple. If you don't like the results, go change the system. So if you don't like the number of people in extreme poverty, or you don't like these outcomes in healthcare or nutrition or education, or people are living in darkness for too long, well, you need to go and figure out how to change the underlying system or systems. It turns out in practice that this is easier said than done. These systems, even when they're functioning badly, tend to be in a stable equilibrium. And even as you try and nudge them or shift them, they quickly come back to their original state. There are many reasons for this, but one of the strongest reasons is they've got stakeholders with entrenched interests. So any perturbation is resisted. So as a result, to actually drive systems change takes a lot of effort, a lot of resources, a lot of time, and it's uncertain, and therefore hard to measure. So one of the questions I've got for Gaurav actually is, how do you measure these progress on these system journeys? And so funders are also a little bit reluctant. They find that it's much easier to fund a well-designed program with clear outputs and outcomes. And so this is why I think systems change remains a daunting affair. Now, if you do decide you're going to try and attempt systems change, it's obvious that you have to get many of the stakeholders working together across business, government, private, the social sector, citizens themselves. And again, this is non-trivial. You can try and get them into informal arrangements, but usually it's helpful to have a formal collaborative or a formal alliance. And in those alliances, the participants or members still have their identity, still do much of what they did before. But for the purposes of this alliance, they're willing to come together in pursuit of a higher objective. Now that happens only if there's a quid pro quo. They see real value in terms of either I get access to more money or more expertise, or together we can accomplish something which I couldn't individually. So if that proposition is not strong, the alliance remains, like many alliances, a mere announcement. Now, first of all, bringing together these alliances, managing them, keeping them together, getting them to actually accomplish something is difficult. Why? Because, as they say, it's like herding cats. It's entirely voluntary, and it's democratic. And so unless you have a small team or an organization behind it, which is called a backbone organization. I use the term from an old SSIR article, which was quite seminal. Other terms include secretariat, which I avoid because it feels a bit bureaucratic, or engine room, or there are a number of terms for this. But you need a small group that is actually the glue that is keeping this alliance together, keeping its eye on the system change, and doing a variety of functions, including generating, mobilizing resources, not just for the backbone, but for all the alliance partners. So there's a variety of functions that need to be done if you're going to get this alliance working, and you need a backbone organization. Now, the third point I want to talk about is funding. It turns out to be, unsurprisingly, critical fuel. And there are two types of funding which we have learned are absolutely crucial. This first is this assured operating support that allows this backbone organization to focus on systems change. If you don't have that, what happens is you're on this treadmill of fundraising, and pretty soon you accept any programmatic funding so that you can take the 10% overhead or whatever it is just to keep your lights on. And that is the beginning of the end, because you deviate from your core mission and theory of change and so forth. So having that kind of core operating support is crucial. I'll come back to that. The second is you need a reasonable pool, and over time a large pool of flexible funding that can be deployed in an incredible variety of ways, including, as I've said, technical assistance, capacity building, guarantees, blended finance, etc. Now, the problem with this sort of capital is it's very hard to measure ROI and linkages to outputs and outcomes. And so in the absence of a really robust MEL, funders get leery about committing too much capital with these sorts of uncertain outcomes. And the third aspect of funding is collaborative. No individual funder has either the capacity or the appetite to put in all that is required. So you do need to stitch together a collaborative of funders. And finally, the point I wanted to make very strongly, which I suspect will find resonance in this room, is you can't just cobble together this funding by aggregating programs, okay? And so what I'm finding is, even though more and more funders are getting the idea of systems change, the mindset shift that needs to still occur is quite massive. And perhaps, Gaurav, that's the point you want to pick up. Now, here's a list of things which I decided to put down about what I wish I knew at the front end of these journeys, okay, which I've learned at considerable expense, and we have learned collectively after 3 to 4 years of this journey. The first is, look, the time for incrementalism is over. I think we can recognize that in this room. The last 3 days, I think we all understood the importance of what Rockefeller calls big bets, which earlier used to be called big, hairy, audacious goals. We need that. But I also like to keep in mind that when you announce these big goals, you often don't know how you're going to get there. And so you have to have this mindset and temperament that Premier Deng Xiaoping talked about in the 70s when China was just beginning its long march towards being a developed country. He said, we've got to cross the mighty river by feeling our way across the stones. So you don't know how you're going to get there, but you have this experimental mindset. And you said, look, I'm perfectly willing to try many things, and gradually I'm confident we'll get there. The second I've talked about is a backbone organization, but I talk about 3 specific characteristics of backbone organizations which are important. First is they've got to be small and agile. Okay? If you end up with a large secretariat, you're going to become bureaucratic, and this alliance is likely to be sluggish. The second is you have to be entrepreneurial, which means what? You have to be willing to test and try many things quickly and dump what doesn't work and scale what works. You have to be quick to see and seize opportunities, and you have to be willing to be able to bootstrap your resources. So this sort of mindset and culture and capabilities are essential. And finally, you need real expertise. If you're going to solve a problem in climate or energy transition or whatever, particularly in a small organization, you can't just have generalists with passion and great intentions. You need real expertise. And all this sounds incredibly obvious, except what I found is it's incredibly hard to do in practice. Perhaps, Gaurav, that's another theme to pick up. As I said before, the funding challenge is enormous, and unless you have committed anchor funders, it's very difficult to accomplish very much. And we were lucky in GAP, the Global Energy Alliance, to have both Rockefeller and IKEA Foundation as our anchor funders. And in GAME, we had IKEA Foundation and the Gates Foundation. But without such long-term committed funders, it's difficult. Tipping points. One of the things that has really come home to me is the importance about thinking about these tipping points in systems. Good example of that is the economics of battery storage. It turns out that if you're going to have more and more renewable energy, you need very large capacity battery storage systems, both to deal with the intermittency of electricity, but also to smooth out these things so the grid is stable. Problem is the economics of these are not yet favorable, even though the cost of batteries is plummeted. And so in India, we've put together a project which has tried to achieve market viability of these systems. So essentially, Saurabh, I don't know if you talked about it on day one, but what they've been able to do is bring down the cost of battery storage systems to about 5 rupees per unit. And meanwhile, through regulatory innovation, has allowed the utility to monetize this to the extent of about 8 rupees a unit. So you've got real margin out here. So now we can get out of the way, let the market take over, and we don't need guarantees, we don't need subsidies and so forth, and you're able to assemble already about 1 gigawatt of projects. This is an example of understanding where there's a tipping point, bringing together the right actors, finding a scalable solution, and then just driving that to scale. So if you don't find a tipping point fairly quickly, you have a credibility gap. Okay? And that's one of the risks in systems change, that you do lots of good projects, each of which has nice outcomes, but collectively they don't really push the system into a discernibly different state. So these tipping points are what I call locomotives, and you need multiple locomotives to which you can attach things. That leads me to my penultimate point, which is being an alliance versus the alliance. 3.5 years ago, when we were just conceptualizing what is today GAP, Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, which is a mouthful, as you can see, we actually would have preferred a much shorter one like the Global Energy Alliance. It's much easier. But then you go to the internet, as I did last night, and there are more than 20 different energy alliances. Some are international energy alliances of different sorts, there are global ones, etc. So this is a crowded field, and we're out there as an early entrant, as one more participant in this crowded field. But we quickly need to, if you're going to actually make meaningful change, you have to emerge like Gavi did as the preeminent alliance in your space, okay? And to do that, you have to deliver two things. One is breakthroughs, or tipping these, in particularly around these tipping points. And the second is the partners, the members of this alliance have to see real value. So today, if you're going to do anything at scale in immunization, you have to go to Gavi. And I think a successful alliance needs to have that ambition and actually deliver against that. The last and final point is a super obvious one, but again, a difficult one to achieve in practice. Leadership matters, and it matters profoundly. It matters, it's consequential in everything we do in life, but particularly when you're solving these intractable societal scale problems, leadership matters a lot. And it's not just one heroic leader that we all rally behind, but it's a set of leaders who have particularly three characteristics. The first is intensity. Anytime I've seen any organization accomplish something significant, you usually can find a person who's a force of nature, okay? And I often talk to my teams and groups across all the organizations about the quote of Buddha, who said, look, if you're going to achieve enlightenment, you need to chase it with the same intensity with which a man whose hair is on fire chases water. So if we're going to solve these kinds of problems, we need to bring intensity to bear. The second one is tenacity. These are difficult problems. Very, very uncertain outcomes, and there are days when you really, really can be quite despondent, and you have to pick yourself up and just find the energy to keep going. So that tenacity is important, courage is important. So look, the systems change work is hard. It's daunting, and it's not for the faint of heart. However, I love the quote of the Rabbi Hillel, if not now, when, and if not us, who? With that, I'll turn it back to you.
Fantastic. Please give him a round of applause. That's an enormous amount you've covered in a very small time. You asked, I have a whole bunch of questions for you, but you did ask me one question, which was around measurement, and you also asked about mindset shift. And I think amongst funders to think about ecosystem. And I think this whole idea of ecosystem shift, measurement, and mindset shift are actually completely connected, right? Because I think all of us, especially people who are then thinking about funding, people who are thinking about doing, want that reward, right? And that reward comes from being able to measure what it is that you have done. But the question of how do you actually measure ecosystems is actually about changing the question itself. What people are very used to is adding the sum total of their programs. Programs have all these point-in-time measures of how many people you're affected, how deeply, and now let's add all of that up, and that sort of adds up to some ecosystem effect. That is, I think, one of the foremost mistakes around this. The reality is, and I'll give an example, we need to think about this like a road. You're traveling on a road. At an ecosystem level, you need to know the shape of the road. Is it going to turn right? Is it going to turn left? What curves does it have? You need to know the speed at which you are traveling on that road, and you need to know the direction. Are you going forward, or are you going backwards? And I'll give a real example of this. Over a decade ago, we were asked to look at this whole question of decentralized energy, how to get different types of, whether it's solar rooftop systems, lanterns, and so forth, into hands of people who had no access to any sort of modern lighting. And the question that was then being asked is, how do we think about this? How do we measure progress? And the immediate answer was, let's look at sales data and do the usual thing, right? This is how many households are buying this and so forth, and every day you will get some number. Now it's 100,000, now it's 110,000. But actually, what's the ecosystem? Well, the shape of the ecosystem is it's an S-curve. This is a technology product. It is going to behave exactly like mobile phones would, which is at some point, if 10 to 15% of people in your village had this product, the rest of you will want it, right? That's the shape of this ecosystem. So then the question becomes, how fast is your set of ecosystem actors driving every village to get to 10, 15% penetration? Actually, it matters less that one village or one area has 70% penetration if lots of others are still at 1%. The ecosystem doesn't shift. The ecosystem shifts when everyone hits about 10, 15% because the shape of the curve is exponential from that point onwards. Network effects start to jump in. And that is the way you have to think about ecosystem measurement, which is how do you move away from point in time and you start thinking about direction and shape. And I think we're still coming to terms with that. Funders, people who are involved in execution in thinking about this. But if we can change the question, then we can also achieve mindset shift. And there's a similar, we won't have time to go into it, but I always find one of the most fascinating examples is to think about what a particularly active teenager in Europe sitting around and starting to protest about climate change, how that one person has affected the ecosystem of climate change. That effect is measurable. It's measurable because instead of talking about, well, did this coal plant get shut down as a result of her protest, you can actually measure the sentiment change amongst the populations around the world from each one of those protests. By actually looking at the direction of travel, and instead of trying to measure an action, starting to measure the intention of actions in populations. So again, this same thinking about forget point in time work, start to actually think about direction is how you can actually think about ecosystems.
Yeah, but at this point, most conventional attempts at measurement and evaluation are actually part of the problem. They're holding us back.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's also changing rapidly
Yeah.
because of technology, right? I mean, the sentiment analysis I just described, only possible in the last 3 years, right? And I think, but one question I have for you is, you know, there's that saying about, you know, go, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go further, go together. I probably messed that up, actually. In a way, we need to do both. We're running out of time. We need speed, but we need to go further. And alliances have always been accused of, sure, there's more power, there's more ability to go further, but they're slow. What does it take to break that compromise?
Yeah, so we need both speed and scale. And I think we have a hypothesis of how you achieve this within the Global Energy Alliance, which is, I think you lead with ideas and create opportunities that everybody wants to be a part of. So again, that, you know, if I use a real example, and the architect of that is sitting at the second table, the government of Maharashtra, which is a very large state in Western India, has a giant problem with electricity. It's got the highest tariffs in the country. It's making it uncompetitive to do business there. All of it is, you know, fossil fuel based, and they have a shortage of electricity. And you project out with the economic activity, it's going to get really, really catastrophic. So we saw an opportunity there, and we engaged. And you know, what was really important is the process of engagement, which is very, very inclusive. So everybody had buy-in to the final plan, which has 130 discrete projects. We talked about it this morning with AI IPUs in the front. And now we've created a government enablement unit, which is actually out there responsible for designing, bidding out these projects, blah, blah, blah. And you've created a framework for everybody to plug in. Providers of capital, you know, companies like Siemens or GE Vernova or others to come in. And as a result of that, now 5, 6 other states says, hey, we want to be part of this. So we're creating a whole new entity, which is with an open architecture that allows all kinds of actors to come in and plug in. Now, so what are you doing here? You're leading with an idea. You're, you know, through experimentation, creating one proof point and an opportunity, and then you're creating an architecture that allows lots and lots of people to pile onto this, and you know, this is beginning to snowball. I think this is indicative of the kind of approach that we need to take, and we're beginning to take in many parts.
Say more, because, you know, I understand the concept of idea scaling, but ideas scale at the speed of trust. And so I'm curious in that example, how did you build trust?
Saurabh, how did you build trust? Because I've been an interested spectator in this, but a crisp answer. Yeah, but trust was essential and is essential.
Basically, we as GAP, we don't have any commercial interest. So that with the government is the first step of trust. Number two, we brought to them that they did not have. They did not have the capacity to think through what the issues are. How do we go ahead to create a plan which is what they wanted? And that's why these two things really build the trust.
Great, thanks, Saurabh. The second question, in your presentation, I saw at the end, you talked about not an alliance, but the alliance. Now, I think there are sometimes, that kind of statement can also seem scary. If alliances are often seen by people as not representing them, right? And there's one of the big accusations that now a bunch of people have now come together, they have been able to exercise greater power through coming together, but who are they representing? That whole question of shifting power suddenly takes on an even more acute aspect. Do you find that the alliances we've often described as successful are representative? And how can we make them more representative?
No, so I think that's a very, very good question. I'm not sure we've figured out the answer to this. All I know is we've acutely conscious and intentional about trying to be representative, okay? So when you form something like GAP, it's very obvious that some of the initial anchor funders have a seat at the table. But then if you're not careful, suddenly everybody at the board level or whatever looks like they're from the global north, good intentions, a lot of money, but trying to do things to the global south. And the global south is tired of this, okay? So we try to make sure that we have representatives from each region on the board. So it starts right from that level. One of our board members is a lady from Mexico who was a former deputy energy minister out there, and she is, passionate about indigenous communities and involving them and so forth. So there's a proxy out there who's giving them some voice. One of the other design decisions we made in GAP is decentralize as much as possible. We didn't get it right in V1, we're getting it right in V2, which is you move resources and smart people into the regions. So many of these things have a birth defect where they assume that all smart people live where the headquarters are. Okay, so all thinking happens there, and then the doing happens in the countries. So we're trying to, actually avoid that and move things down here. Even in the regions, we're trying to create advisory structures which actually give voice to different stakeholders, particularly the voiceless. So I'm not saying we're doing it very well or perfectly, let alone perfectly, but we're trying to be intentional about it.
Yeah, and I think there is still a challenge where we have people from the Global South, but we select people from the Global South that speak Global North.
Yeah, like me.
Right, that's, and me. And now we're speaking to you, so we're part of the problem here. I have one more question. It has two parts to it, and then I think we're going to turn it to the audience. And this is more of a cynic's view, right? So there are alliances being announced all the time. And there is this, so one part of this question is, there's low entry to most alliances. There's very little skin in the game. And I don't know how many of you track the alliances you hear about and see what they've done 2 years later, right? And so at one level, how do you stop this from just being a PR exercise, because the entry cost is very little?
Yeah, there's zero entry barrier, okay, which is why there's such a proliferation. And the half-life of most alliances is probably pretty short, but there are also lots of zombie alliances that manage to raise just enough money to keep the lights on, but aren't necessarily making progress towards their goals. And this is where I think, Gaurav, that leadership comes in. You need to make sure that there are a set of people there who are just intent on driving those outcomes, okay? So that's what differentiates it from mere ambition, mere announcement of a hairy, audacious goal into something that may actually accomplish something over time. So I think we obsess often about the what. I've learned over time to now obsess over the who.
Yeah.
Yeah? Who is part of this?
So let me actually now jump to the other side of that. There's you've raised a lot of money, there's a healthy alliance going, and then there's a temptation to be quite egotistical. I mean, I'm reading this book, if I think about a perfect ecosystem that we all sort of understand is a city, right? A city is a classic ecosystem. You talk to urban planners, and increasingly urban planners will start to say, plan nothing. Just plan where the roads go and how wide should the roads be. Everything else is allowing decentralized systems, individuals, citizens, to create the city through a sort of set of emergent properties about their interaction. It's very easy in an alliance, big names, you've been, World Bank, country heads, and so forth, to suddenly come together and think that the world is a set of chess pieces that you're moving around. Is that a bit of a challenge that alliances sometimes lose focus because now they've got so many people, so now we're trying to do 12 things as opposed to just figuring out where should the roads go and how wide should the roads be?
Yeah, I don't know whether it's a challenge so much as a risk. I think it's a very, very big risk because you genuinely have positive intentions. Now somebody has entrusted you with reasonable capital, and you've got a lot of smart people. Smart people have good ideas. And so there's a lot of pressure now that you have that money to start doing something, showing results. Okay, there's that intense pressure. So what do? You get on the ground and start doing things, whether or not they make sense or they're the ones that the community wishes or the country wishes and so forth. And so yes, we've made some of those mistakes. Okay, fortunately we've completed a reset that minimizes that. So much of our work across the 4 regions, Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and LATAM, is now emergent. So this energy transition planning isn't something we had come in with a preconceived idea, okay? So we come there, we listen to people and see where is the energy, where is the pain, where's the stone in the shoe, and then that's what we've sort of focused on. So yeah, I think we need to be humble and open-minded as we go about our work. And when you make mistakes, have the courage to admit it and reset. That's what we've done.
Brilliant. We have one question from the audience which has come up on our stage, but I'll also take some. So if we can get the mics to one over here, and we'll take one more question. But while we're doing that, there is already a question from the audience, which I really love. Here's how I'll phrase it, which is, you have lots of people in an alliance, there's going to be conflict. And sometimes alliances are actually conflict averse, which means you go to the lowest common denominator. How do you allow healthy conflicts to happen?
Yeah. No, it's a superb question because in all the 3 alliances that I'm part of, we're at different phases. So there's this framework in HR where about the stages that teams go through, and all of you probably know it, which is forming, storming, norming, and performing. Okay? And I found that these alliances also are teams of a different sort. They also go through these phases. They form, there's a lot of euphoria and optimism and goodwill, and then you start doing the work, and there's tons of conflict. Okay? And in fact, it's worse than normal organizations because, in a sense here, everybody is passionate about the mission. Okay? They become jihadis for their ideas and beliefs. And so the conflict can be quite severe. And so you then have to call a timeout and get into the norming and reset phase, and then hopefully you can graduate to a performing thing. So I think what you need to realize is this is natural evolution, but don't get stuck in the fighting phase. You have to emerge out of that. But this is just normal, okay?
I think most form, reform, and then conform.
Yeah.
As opposed to going through that exercise.
I don't like that last bit of conform.
Yeah. Ravi. Yes.
Okay. My name is Ingo Pool from South Pole. I love everything that you have said on change and systemic. And probably like 5 points I can comment on, but I just want to focus on one. And this is a experience that I had throughout my career in terms of how change happens. And I really wanted kind of like you to hear it, maybe also to comment, which is system change often happens as a result of a change in the exterior environment of the system, and it comes from the fringe, from the periphery of the system into the core of the system. Though I think here the key point is alliances need to think outside of the box. And the people who are part of your solution might not be the ones who are already inside of that system, but who are new to this. And here's an example. I also had the privilege of working with Saurabh on the work in India on convergence. And if you look at batteries, right? What really drove the cost curve down in batteries is not their use in a utility setting, it's their use in electric mobility. That's where a lot of the capacity is. That's where the scale is produced. And I think that when we talk about energy transition, we must include in the system the mobility sector. Yeah. And throughout the mobility sector, also the real estate. But like, where is charging? What is charging connect to? The first use of a solar operator with surplus capacity is to charge existing cars that have existing batteries that make money on the basis of the fuel cost, the fossil fuel cost they are replacing. And their use as a storage of surplus solar is therefore capex free. So you see how all of a sudden we solve the cost problem with batteries if we include the bridge to electric mobility. That's what I mean, like outside of the box thinking as a key factor to accelerate, which we early needed, transformation in that other box that we're talking about today, energy transition in the grid.
Thank you. That's a great point. We'll just take one more question because we've run out of time.
Hi.
Got over there. Sorry.
Thanks, Ravi and Gaurav. It's always a pleasure to listen to both of you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, go for it, Ravi.
Excellent. So the question is, Ravi, a lot of times when we think about alliances, we think of them as having a common agenda and a coordinated action across many stakeholders. In my experience, that sort of becomes an organization just by another name. I mean, it just is another organization now. More and more, we are also exploring whether there could be models where there is a common agenda, but uncoordinated action, which is people doing what is in their self-interest, aligned to a common agenda, which truly unlocks network effects that Gaurav talked about as well. Do you see that in your work as well, where we are creating newer forms of collaboration and alliances, which is not coordinated action of all of us coming and doing one thing together, but a network of participants doing uncoordinated work around a common agenda?
Ravi?
Yeah, totally. I think that vision that everybody is now lockstep working determinedly to a common goal and all that is utopian. The real world is way messier, and it probably looks much more like what you describe. So for instance, Mission 300 in Africa, which is a emerging new mission mode project led by the World Bank, which they announced in their spring meetings. They said, look, we are going to commit $25 billion of IDA money to electrify 300 million Africans by the end of the decade. And AFDB jumped on and said they'll put in their money too. And we, along with SE for All, insinuated ourselves into this emerging partnership. Each of us has our own other goals and priorities and independent ways of working. Nobody is going to change and drop everything in order to deliver Mission 300. But around this, we align our capital, we align our efforts. And I think a large part of this is, the glue of this is actually the MEL, the measurement. Are we making progress towards that 300 is part of the glue. And the other part of the glue is a light governance layer that allows us to make sensible sort of policy decisions. But otherwise, each organization is exactly doing what it wishes to do. So I think, and sometimes it appears clumsy, sometimes it is inefficient, but that's the messy nature of the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way to think about it, there are many different types of alliances. Ask the question, what are you anal about? And in the example of, 1,000 flowers bloom, but we all agree to one objective, it is actually the measurement that then drives the thing that you have to stay focused on when you're allowing these 1,000 flowers to bloom. But I think we've run out of time.
Do you notice the red?
Yeah. I have not been anal on time. But Ravi has been fantastic to listen to, so I think well worth going over time. Please thank him. Thank you.
A A big thank you to our speakers. May I please ask for a commemorative photo on stage before you leave? Thank you, Ravi, and thank you, Gaurav, for these important insights. We really, really appreciate your expertise and value such an important contribution to advancing